My name is Gavin Miller. I am 48 years old, and for 6 excruciating months, my existence had been reduced to server logs, diagnostic telemetry, thermal traces, and cold coffee in cardboard cups. The enterprise infrastructure prototype finally went green at exactly 10:14 on a rainy Tuesday morning. For 8 fragile, breathless minutes, the entire third-floor engineering hall stood completely frozen. 40 senior developers, database administrators, and systems specialists stared at the central diagnostic monitors as though taking a sudden breath might shatter the immaculate green execution loops. Screen after screen held clean. The real-time stress simulations remained solid, processing over 50,000 concurrent transactions without dropping a single packet. Men and women who had spent half a year carrying constant anxiety finally loosened their shoulders, unclenching hands that had been locked stiff for weeks. I stood beside the primary terminal with a bone-dry mouth, a clenched jaw, and that heavy, hollow exhaustion that makes victory feel far less like a celebration and much more like surviving a high-impact collision. I had personally dragged that multi-tier software architecture across impossible corporate deadlines, erratic vendor shipments, unvetted third-party API dependencies, and one devastating late-night database corruption that had cost me 3 consecutive nights without sleep. I had ignored explicit medical warnings regarding my spiking blood pressure because executive leadership demanded tangible commercial outcomes, not personal health reports. Before that thin, fleeting sense of relief could even settle into my chest, my workstation speaker chimed with an urgent summons from CEO Stanford Thorne's executive assistant. I was ordered to report to the top-floor corner suite immediately. I knew Stanford Thorne did not invite principal technical architects to his office to offer congratulations or hand out praise. He maintained a dedicated public relations staff for public accolades and lower-level directors for internal celebrations. His executive suite looked precisely as it always did: floor-to-ceiling tinted glass, brushed industrial steel, dark leather furniture, and an atmosphere of oppressive, expensive silence. Stanford stood near the panoramic window looking out over the city skyline, holding a china cup with one hand tucked casually into his tailored trousers, looking as unbothered as a man, reviewing a morning weather report. His 26-year-old son, Mason Thorne, sat near the heavy mahogany conference table, leaning back in an executive leather chair with that polished, expectant posture that privileged young men so frequently mistake for earned authority. Mason was wearing a pristine blue designer suit, twirling an expensive gold pen between his fingers as if he had personally directed every line of underlying code. Stanford did not offer me a seat. He did not inquire about the green diagnostic monitors downstairs or acknowledge 6 months of intense labor. "The prototype phase is officially complete, Gavin," he announced, his voice flat, measured, and entirely unburdened by empathy or warmth. "We are initiating an immediate transition into a new executive leadership structure for full commercial deployment." The words hung in the air before the brutal reality behind them fully registered in my mind. My physical security access card was already sitting cleared on his desk. My formal severance agreement was neatly aligned beside his leather blotter, and my system administrator credentials were scheduled for complete revocation before noon. I turned my head and looked directly at Mason, deliberately ignoring his father. Mason did not even possess the basic decency to appear uncomfortable or embarrassed. He looked eager, hungry, and smug, ready to step into a spotlight he had done absolutely nothing to earn. "This is about the $500,000 project completion bonus," I said, keeping my voice low and steady despite the sudden pulse of anger pounding behind my eyes. Stanford offered the faint, practiced smile corporate executives employ when they want cold, ruthless self-dealing to look like high-level strategic vision. "This decision is entirely about organizational alignment and what the company requires for its next evolutionary phase," he replied smoothly, without blinking. It had nothing to do with corporate alignment. It was a masterpiece of cold, calculated timing. It was about permitting me to carry a fragile, highly volatile enterprise system through the fire, absorbing all the personal health risks and operational dangers, only to execute me the exact instant the success credit hardened into guaranteed financial compensation. Then Stanford uttered the sentence that permanently severed 4 years of dedicated architectural service without a single shred of hesitation or gratitude. You were exceptionally valuable for the initial construction phase, Gavin, but having my son here is more than enough for what comes after. There it was. Pure, unadulterated executive nepotism, stripped of corporate euphemisms and standing shameless in the middle of the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in pointless debate or beg for fairness. I picked up the severance folder, picked up my personal notebook, turned on my heel, and walked out of the office. Mason stepped aside to clear my exit path, thrusting his chest out as though he had personally built the Enterprise Tower. In the polished black glass of the executive elevator, my reflection looked far less shocked than I expected. Subconsciously, I had been bracing for their corporate betrayal for months by the time the elevator reached the ground floor lobby. My network access permissions had already begun failing in real time. My digital credentials were being systematically purged with a speed that exposed meticulous advanced preparation. Stanford had drafted my termination orders, days before the final diagnostic test loop turned green. They simply required my physical hands on the keyboard long enough to navigate the system across the finish line. As I walked through the lobby, several junior developers watched me from behind their partitions, their eyes wide with disbelief, but none dared speak. I walked out through the glass doors into the cold autumn rain, carrying a single brown cardboard box containing 4 years of my professional life. Outside, the air felt sharp and harsh against my skin. I stood on the wet concrete plaza, looking back up at the 70-story glass building I had helped keep structurally sound, sustained by a single quiet, persistent question. What would happen when Stanford and Mason Thorne finally realized that the architect they had discarded was the only person alive, who understood how to keep the entire complex machinery from tearing itself apart? I arrived at my suburban home carrying the heavy cardboard box pressed against my chest and set it down on the kitchen dining table. The house was cold and still in that blunt, unyielding way characteristic of empty rooms. No urgent system alerts chimed on my personal monitors. No frantic messaging channels demanded immediate architectural decisions. Just the heavy, suffocating quiet of a 20-year career upended in less than 2 minutes. Once the initial surge of adrenaline began to recede, the subtle details of Stanford Thorne's calculated maneuver began lining up clearly in my mind. Over the preceding 6 weeks, Mason Thorne had systematically forced his way into every high-level technical update, posing superficial questions in a loud, authoritative voice and nodding sagely, as though wearing a $5,000 tailored suit granted instant technical comprehension. Corporate finance had quietly accelerated the formal milestone verification schedule without consulting the engineering leads. Approval workflows that traditionally remained under technical governance had drifted upward into the executive suite, disguised as streamlined administrative efficiency. At the time, I had written it off as routine executive micromanagement. That had been my fatal error. I had placed far too much trust in the work itself. I had naively believed that if the underlying architecture was immaculate, no corporate politician could erase the engineer who had constructed it. That was not professional discipline, it was arrogant pride, and it had left me completely exposed at the exact moment the blade fell. The software prototype was complete only in the narrow, artificial sense that mattered to corporate executives chasing quarterly earnings announcements. It could navigate a controlled demonstration on dedicated, isolated servers. But beyond the clean environment of the laboratory, in the chaotic real-world environment of live enterprise deployment, with erratic data streams, vendor variations, latency spikes, and unvetted client hardware, the system was extraordinarily complex and demanding. It relied on delicate failover routines, manual thread allocations, and unwritten operational calibrations that had never been documented in formal manuals because I had always executed them personally. I had built custom memory buffers and custom load balancers that required manual oversight during heavy traffic spikes. I did not tamper with a single line of code-based logic after my dismissal. I did not encrypt configuration files, erase databases, or plant hidden bugs. I simply walked away, refusing to function as an unpaid, uncredited safety net for corrupt men who had stolen my life's work. The following morning, corporate communications issued a company-wide announcement email. The document lavishly praised Mason Thorne for his visionary leadership in guiding the enterprise core to historic milestone completion. My name appeared at the absolute bottom of the internal release, reduced to a single, sterile sentence thanking me for past foundational assistance. The corporate equivalent of praising the dishwasher after claiming personal credit for cooking the banquet. Attached to the announcement was the revised executive bonus distribution schedule. While exact monetary figures were masked from general employees, the structural allocation was unmistakable. The $500,000 completion payout had been shifted entirely to Mason's department account. Curator Edith Abbott, head of financial compliance, had clearly recognized the improper alteration, leaving the digital ledger marked as pending in the internal enterprise system like a dormant explosive no one dared touch. 2 days later, Mason's name officially replaced mine as the primary inventor on the master patent filings. That was the moment I realized this was no longer a routine wrongful termination. It was an organized corporate robbery. For the first 7 days, the corporate illusion remained intact. Congratulatory emails circulated through the upper floors. Board members applauded Stanford Thorne's executive stewardship, thrilled by a flawless technical milestone that boosted corporate valuation. Mason strutted through the halls like a decorated commander, wearing confidence he had borrowed from my sleepless nights. But by the second week, operational reality began collecting high interest on their deception. The primary client corporation, led by Executive Director Elias Montgomery, initiated live stress testing under real-world transactional volumes. Small data anomalies that had remained dormant during laboratory runs began triggering massive system bottlenecks. Processing queues froze. Automated failover redundancies locked up in infinite loops, throwing critical error codes across 40 client servers. Elias Montgomery, a formidable executive who tolerated zero incompetence, called an emergency technical review conference. During the call, Mason attempted to bluff his way through using broad corporate buzzwords and superficial reassurances. Elias was completely unmoved. He demanded precise technical explanations, specific algorithmic pathways, and immediate remediation schedules. When Mason stammered and tried to defer to junior staff, Elias cut him off sharp. "Mason, if you are the lead architect of this platform, explain the core memory allocation logic right now, or we pull the contract." Mason sat mute, sweat dripping down his collar, utterly incapable of answering basic technical questions. Panic swept through the engineering department. Senior developers admitted to management that while they possessed the written documentation, they lacked the deep conceptual framework required to resolve the cascading failures. Stanford Thorne attempted to dismiss the breakdown as routine post-launch friction. But Elias Montgomery formally halted commercial deployment, threatening immediate multi-million-dollar default penalties. Desperate and terrified, Mason called my personal phone that evening. His voice was tight, strained, and stripped of its former arrogance. He asked if I could drop by the office for a brief consultation to clarify a few minor operational nuances. Brief consultation. The phrase was insulting. They were not seeking a professional partnership. They were seeking emergency technical salvage without acknowledging their theft. I told Mason with absolute calm that my consulting fee was infinite and that I would not return under any circumstances. I assumed my unequivocal refusal on the phone would end their overtures. I was mistaken. The following afternoon, my front doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Mason Thorne was standing on my porch, wearing a long wool coat and polished leather shoes. He looked deeply irritated, as though my refusal to save him was an unpardonable personal inconvenience. He offered no apology. He stepped forward aggressively, attempting to push past me into my private hallway. I held my ground, blocking the entrance. He insisted the project was merely being misunderstood by the client, that Elias Montgomery was overreacting, and that the engineering team simply required 4 hours of my time to stabilize the server clusters. I looked directly into his eyes and kept my voice icy calm. You fired me to steal my professional credit, reallocate my $500,000 bonus into your private account, and present my life's work as your own invention, I said clearly. Now you are standing on my private doorstep because the system refuses to lie for you. Mason's face flushed deep red with rage. He attempted persuasion, then pivoted to moral coercion, claiming that if I possessed any true professional ethics, I would not allow personal bitterness to damage a vital commercial initiative. It was breathtaking entitlement. He wanted to destroy my career, steal my compensation, and still demand my professional ethics to shield his incompetence. I gave him a single, unyielding answer: no. I stated clearly that I would not advise him, would not review his error logs, and would not rescue his reputation. Mason's executive polish disintegrated completely. "You are deliberately sabotaging something that does not belong to you anymore," he screamed, stepping closer into my personal space. I met his furious gaze with absolute stillness. "The only thing destroying your project is fake competence standing on real work." Overwhelmed by toxic rage and unaccustomed to defiance, Mason lost control. His arm snapped back, and he struck me squarely in the face with a heavy closed fist, knocking me backward into the hallway wall. The violent blow cracked across my jawbone, sending a blinding flash of pain through my face and throwing me off balance against the entryway coat rack. Blood welled inside my mouth, tasting metallic and sharp. But as I steadied my footing, I did not lash out. I did not scream, throw a counterpunch, or engage in a physical brawl. I stepped back deeper into the hallway, pulled the heavy solid oak door closed, and engaged both deadbolts. Mounted directly above my front porch light was an industrial-grade, high-definition commercial security camera equipped with continuous dual-channel audio and optical stabilization. It had captured every single fraction of a second in uncompressed 40K resolution. Mason's verbal threats, his deliberate step across my threshold, his furious curses, and the unprovoked physical assault on private property. Inside my kitchen, I pressed a clean paper towel against my swelling cheekbone, feeling the tissue inflammation expanding rapidly beneath the skin. I took 3 deep, controlled breaths, dialed 911 on my mobile phone, and reported the violent assault to the local police department with absolute composure. Within 12 minutes, 2 marked patrol units pulled up in front of my home. Officers documented my physical facial injuries, took my detailed formal statement, and downloaded the raw digital security file directly from my home server. The responding sergeant was unequivocal. The crystal-clear video footage provided irrefutable proof of felony physical assault, trespass, and intentional infliction of bodily harm. Following established legal protocol, I immediately proceeded to an urgent care medical facility. Emergency medical staff performed comprehensive x-rays of my jaw and skull, documented the severe soft tissue bruising along my face, and generated an official medical evaluation report stamped with exact atomic timestamps. That was the critical structural difference between emotional panic and strategic discipline. Every single physical mark, every witness statement, and every minute was locked into an unalterable legal record. Before the Thorne family could mobilize corporate public relations to twist the narrative. While I was seated in the medical examination room, my phone lit up with 4 consecutive missed calls from CEO Stanford Thorne. He left a series of voicemails, his tone noticeably anxious but still attempting to project supreme executive authority. He suggested that mature, civilized executives ought to resolve personal misunderstandings privately through quiet diplomatic channels rather than involving public law enforcement authorities or unnecessary legal actions. He even hinted at offering a quiet consulting retainer if I agreed to drop the police report. I ignored his messages entirely. Instead, I called Lenora Quinn, a legendary senior litigation partner specializing in high-stakes corporate fraud, executive misconduct, and severe employment retaliation. Lenora met me in her top-floor office early the next morning. She carefully reviewed the hospital medical reports, examined the photographic evidence, watched the high-definition security footage on her monitor, and analyzed my initial termination contract. A cold, calculating smile spread across her face. "Gavin," she said quietly, setting the files down on her desk, "this is no longer merely a wrongful termination claim or a straightforward personal injury lawsuit. This is a comprehensive criminal and corporate conspiracy involving physical violence, executive retaliation, and systemic corporate fraud. Lenora acted with terrifying speed. She immediately filed formal criminal charges against Mason Thorne for felony assault and battery, securing an emergency judicial protective order, prohibiting him from coming within 500 feet of my person or residence. But she did not restrict her strategy to the physical attack. Exercising federal pre-litigation discovery powers and issuing statutory evidence preservation notices, she drove directly into the financial infrastructure of Stanford Thorne's corporate empire. What we uncovered over the subsequent 48 hours transformed a personal legal battle into a catastrophic corporate emergency. Controller Edith Abbott, recognizing that federal corporate governance statutes impose severe personal criminal liability on financial officers who concealed executive fraud, responded immediately to our preservation demands. She provided certified internal digital audit logs establishing that less than 3 hours after my termination, Stanford Thorne had personally logged into the executive compensation system using administrative overrides. He had retroactively altered project sign-off dates, scrubbed my name from internal authorization ledgers, and manually redirected the $500,000 project completion bonus pool into Mason's personal compensation schedule. Lenora's forensic IT specialist analyzed the system metadata, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Stanford's private IP address had accessed the master compensation database at 11:42 that night. Furthermore, the digital evidence proved that Stanford had completely bypassed mandatory board approval protocols, committing a flagrant, actionable breach of fiduciary duty under federal corporate law. He had misused corporate capital to enrich his son while exposing the firm to catastrophic breach of contract liability with Elias Montgomery's client organization. Lenora drafted a massive federal civil complaint naming Stanford Thorne, Mason Thorne, and the corporation as joint defendants. The lawsuit outlined detailed counts of felony assault, constructive discharge, illegal retaliation, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate self-dealing. When Lenora reviewed the final draft with me, her expression was resolute. "They believe they could strike you on your own porch and intimidate you into silence," she said. "Instead, their violent arrogance has handed us the exact master key required to dismantle their entire board of directors." News of the criminal indictment and impending federal corporate lawsuit struck the corporate headquarters like an atomic blast. Board Chair Wallace Drake immediately summoned an emergency closed-door session of the board of directors. During the initial hours of the meeting, several senior board members attempted to minimize the scandal, proposing a discreet financial settlement to cover my medical expenses and secure a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. They still foolishly believed the crisis could be isolated, managed, and swept away from public view. That comfortable illusion disintegrated when client executive Elias Montgomery delivered a fatal blow. Having reviewed the deteriorating technical telemetry and discovering that Mason Thorne had fraudulently misrepresented his role as lead architect, Elias formally terminated the $90 million enterprise contract. He cited material breach of contract, intentional misrepresentation of core technical personnel, and operational incompetence. The public announcement wiped out 25% of the company's total market capitalization in less than 3 hours of trading. Gospel panic paralyzed the executive suite. Stanford Thorne attempted to execute frantic damage control, dragging senior engineering managers into private offices and demanding they sign backdated affidavits, asserting that Mason had served as the primary technical director since project inception. He attempted to coerce Controller Edith Abbott into altering the financial audit logs retroactively to remove his administrative signatures. Edith refused flatly, informing him that her private legal counsel had already delivered the unalterable digital audit files to federal law enforcement authorities. Simultaneously, Mason Thorne, facing impending criminal arrest, succumbed to total panic. He attempted to contact 2 principal software engineers who had worked under my direct supervision, offering them immediate vice president promotions and stock options if they agreed to sign sworn statements claiming I had voluntarily abandoned the project. Lenora Quinn was notified of these illegal contact attempts within minutes. She immediately filed an emergency motion for witness tampering and obstruction of justice against Mason, compounding his criminal indictment. On Thursday morning, Lenora walked directly into Board Chair Wallace Drake's private suite and delivered the complete, unredacted evidence portfolio. She played the crisp 40K security video showing Mason striking me on my porch. She presented the certified medical records detailing my facial bone trauma. Then she laid out the immutable financial audit logs provided by Edith Abbott, highlighting Stanford's personal digital signatures on backdated bonus reallocation forms. Lenora looked Wallace Drake directly in the eye across the table. "If this board of directors does not take decisive action within 24 hours, she stated with absolute composure, we will file this entire evidentiary package in open federal court and release the raw security video to national television networks. Every single board member will face personal, civil, and criminal liability for aiding and abetting executive embezzlement and violent physical assault." The board meeting that afternoon was swift, brutal, and historic. Wallace Drake presented the evidence portfolio to the assembled directors. For 4 long years, Stanford Thorne had ruled the board with ruthless arrogance, convincing directors that his aggressive executive tactics were essential for corporate profitability. But confronted with irrefutable video proof of felony violence, federal audit trails of financial self-dealing, and the total collapse of their primary enterprise client, the board turned on him without mercy. Several directors openly expressed outrage at how Stanford had exposed them to personal legal ruin to satisfy his son's greed. By unanimous vote, the board terminated CEO Stanford Thorne for cause, stripping him instantly of his executive severance package, unvested stock options, and retirement benefits. Within 2 hours, uniformed state police officers arrived at corporate headquarters. Mason Thorne was taken into custody directly from his executive suite, handcuffed in front of the entire office staff, and booked on felony charges of assault, criminal trespass, and witness tampering. His bail was set high, and his professional standing was completely destroyed. Stanford Thorne walked out of the corporate tower he had ruled for a decade, flanked by private security guards, carrying his personal office items in a single cardboard box, the exact humiliating fate he had inflicted on me 2 weeks prior. As he crossed the lobby, staff members watched in absolute silence, refusing to offer a single word of sympathy. The corrupt executive dynasty he had spent years building had collapsed into criminal indictments, financial ruin, and public disgrace in less than 14 days. In the weeks following the executive purge, the former corporation entered a terminal operational collapse. Its stock price cratered to historic lows, secondary client contracts were canceled across multiple divisions, and 5 senior board members resigned to avoid impending regulatory prosecution. The remaining board leadership attempted to reach me through third-party intermediaries, offering a massive financial settlement and the title of Chief Technology Officer if I would return to salvage the ruined software architecture. I rejected their proposals without a second thought. Some corporate environments are so deeply infected by toxic corruption that no amount of financial compensation can restore their integrity. 3 weeks after Stanford Thorne's termination, I received a private meeting invitation from Quentin Vance, the founder and managing partner of Vance Capital, one of the most prestigious technology investment funds in the nation. Quentin requested 40 minutes of my time and suggested meeting at a quiet hotel lounge far removed from the city center. Quentin got straight to the heart of the matter over coffee. "The enterprise architecture you built was brilliant, Gavin," he said, looking at me with deep professional respect. "It collapsed at your former company not because of any technical flaw, but because it was handed to arrogant men who believed nepotism could replace genuine engineering intellect. They tried to run a world-class engine with a driver who didn't even know how to turn the key." Quentin presented a straightforward, transformative proposal. His investment firm was prepared to commit $50 million in growth capital to launch a new independent software enterprise. He offered me full equity co-ownership, complete operational authority, and the position of chief executive officer. He emphasized that he was not seeking to purchase old code or stolen trade secrets. He was investing directly in the mind that had conceived the system in the first place. I agreed to his offer on one non-negotiable condition: absolute corporate governance. The new enterprise would operate with complete financial transparency, independent board oversight, zero family nepotism, and compensation tied strictly to verified merit. Quentin agreed without hesitation, signing the binding term sheet on the spot. Within 90 days, our new technology venture opened its headquarters. Over half of the top engineering talent from my former employer resigned and joined our team, eager to work under leadership that valued technical truth over executive manipulation. We built a brand new multi-tenant platform from the ground up, cleaner, faster, and far more robust than the prototype. Elias Montgomery's organization signed on as our lead enterprise client, transferring their multi-million-dollar contract to our new, superior platform. Meanwhile, the legal consequences for the Thorne family reached their inevitable conclusion. Mason Thorne pled guilty to felony assault, criminal trespass, and witness tampering, receiving a state prison sentence of 18 months, along with mandatory financial restitution. Stanford Thorne faced relentless civil litigation from ruined shareholders and was forced to pay millions of dollars in personal penalties for breach of fiduciary duty and illegal bonus reallocation. He lost his private mansion, his corporate standing, and his legacy. As I stand today in my new corner office overlooking the city, looking at a clean green diagnostic monitor on my desk, I often reflect on the moment Stanford Thorne told me that having his son was more than enough. Arrogant executives frequently convince themselves that true ownership resides in titles, executive suites, and corporate stamps. They believe they can violently strip the fruits of another man's labor and discard the builder without consequence. They forget a fundamental law of human achievement. A corrupt company can steal your access card, erase your title, and appropriate your past work, but it can never possess the intellect, discipline, and integrity that created the success in the first place. In the end, a stolen crown always crushes the fool who attempts to wear it, while the true architect simply builds a greater kingdom elsewhere. If this story reinforced your belief in standing firm against corporate tyranny and executive abuse, share your perspective in the comments below. Who was ultimately responsible for the collapse? Stanford Thorne for his arrogant nepotism, or Mason Thorne for his violent entitlement?